today's recipe, we'll be preparing streusel coffee cake and talking about important concepts in the kitchen, mise en place, and knowing our equivalents so that we can alter a recipe to fit our needs. To make our streusel coffee cake, we'll need flour, sugar, baking powder, salt, 1 egg, milk, cooking oil, and for the topping we'll need brown sugar, flour, cinnamon, and margarine. There are some optional ingredients that we'll discuss as the recipe is prepared, raisins or chocolate chips in the batter and nuts in the topping, but we are not going to put those in for the recipe that's being made. For today's recipe, we'll need some mixing bowls, a square glass baking dish or metal baking dish, dry measuring cups, liquid measuring cups, measuring spoons, a straight edge spatula, a wire whisk, rubber scraper, a wooden spoon, a butter knife, custard cups, and a pastry blender. We want to start by greasing our pan just with cooking spray. And I've already preheated the oven to 375 degrees. So for our streusel coffee cake recipe today, we're not only going to learn how to make a delicious quick bread coffee cake, we're also going to talk about some general principles when working in the kitchen. One of those main principles is mise en place. Mise en place, literally translated, means put in place. However, there's a lot more to it than that. When we look at the definition for mise en place, we're talking about having all foods and equipment ready before beginning, and it's a state of mental readiness as well. So when we look more specifically at mise en place, it's things like reviewing the menu, or in our case, the recipe, and readying all food, gathering all of your ingredients, all of your equipment needed for a specific preparation before beginning to cook with any of it. We need to set up our work area prior to the time that we're actually mixing things. If herbs need chopped or spices need measured or ground, that needs to take place ahead. And so getting all of those things done helps to get your mind ready to work or to bake, and reading that recipe through is very important. So we're going to make the streusel coffee cake. It has a batter and it has a topping, and as a part of mise en place, after reading the recipe, we can see that the topping really should be prepared first, so that as soon as that cake batter is ready, we can put the topping right on it. So we're going to start with our brown sugar, and we are going to alter this recipe. So the topping on this is pretty delicious, and we are going to double the topping and talk about equivalents. So originally, the recipe calls for 2 tablespoons of brown sugar. So that would be 2 of these. But we're going to double that, and so that would be 4 tablespoons. But an easier way to measure 4 tablespoons, if you know that there are 16 tablespoons in a cup, then you know that 4 tablespoons would be 1/4 of a cup. So just like we talked about with fourths, measuring brown sugar, we're going to pack it in. We're going to make sure we hold the cup and not the spoon. We're going to make sure it heaps over. And we're going to make sure we level it off. And then we're going to go ahead and make sure that it is correct, that it held the shape of that cup before putting it into our mixing bowl. Well, that it wasn't quite packed. So we're just going to dump it back in. Start over. Pack that in, hold the cup, not the handle, because we don't want to break the handle off of the measuring cup. And we're just going to tap that out of the cup itself. And you can see it held the shape. So we're going to go ahead and put that into our mixing bowl. To that, we need to add a few other ingredients. Our flour is originally 1 tablespoon. So that's pretty simple. we'll make it 2 tablespoons. And normally flour, if it goes into a measuring cup, needs to be spooned in, but a tablespoon is a small enough measure. We can go ahead and scoop it up, level it off, put it in our bowl. So there's our flour, 2 tablespoons. Our cinnamon is originally 1 teaspoon. So we're gonna double that and put 2 teaspoons of cinnamon in. So again, we're gonna scoop that up so it's heaping, level it off, 1, 2. There are 2 other ingredients that we can add to our topping. Margarine, which we will add because it's necessary, and then chopped nuts are optional. Notice that I said chopped nuts, which means they would have to be chopped before you measured them. The original amount is a 1/2 cup. You could double that if you liked, if you chose to add those to the topping. And we would stir those in at the very end, just before it was ready to put onto the batter. So before, the margarine is in the refrigerator and it needs to stay there and it needs to stay cold, because when you're making a topping, you're going to use a pastry blender, and anytime you use the pastry blender with margarine or butter, it needs to start out cold so that it works properly. So the first thing we're going to do for our topping, now that we have all the ingredients gathered, is we're going to whisk these 3 ingredients together so they make a nice homogeneous mixture, which means it should all look one. You should not see individual parts of brown sugar, flour, or cinnamon. So now that that's all mixed together with our whisk, we're going to cut it in with the pastry blender. So we have to get the cold margarine out of the refrigerator. To measure our margarine today, we're going to use the stick method, which means I'm going to cut margarine off the sticks. I'm going to use the markings on the wrapper to get 2 tablespoons. And cut that off. There are 8 tablespoons in the stick of margarine. And we're going to put that into our mixing bowl. And we are going to stir that, kind of coat it a little bit before we start pressing and turning with the pastry blender. So we've added our margarine and we've pushed and turned a little. Now we need to scrape the pastry blender clean. If you did not have a pastry blender, you could use 2 knives. Just drag them across like an X. If you become an avid baker, this is a piece of equipment that's worth investing in. You don't use it very often, but when you do, it's very helpful. And we continue with that push, turn motion. A little bit of push, turn, and then we clean it off. And then the step that I cannot emphasize enough in preparing this part of the recipe is that after you clean it off, you have to, what I refer to as stir through. Otherwise, it's going to end up in one great big clump, and that does not work the same. So what we're doing is we're cutting the fat into tiny pieces. That's our margarine in this case. You could use butter if you preferred that, but you would not want to use spread margarine. So it needs to be stick margarine or stick butter. You would not want to use spread butter either. It'd be too soft and it wouldn't come out right. So we're just breaking up that fat into small pieces and coating it with the flour, cinnamon, sugar mixture until the dry, powdery is all picked up. And we really don't see a lot of that around. We see just a little bit left here. For just a couple more push turns. But you can see it's really starting to come together. You can see the bottom of the bowl pretty clearly at this point. And there's not a lot of loose loose powdery ingredient in the bottom of the bowl. So that tells us we're pretty close. We're just going to stir this a little bit more, and this looks perfect. So I'll show you one that went a little too far, and you'll be able to see the difference between what it should look like and what's too far gone. So you can see in these two bowls, this one is nice and powdery and light, and this one has become just great big clumps. And the problem is this gets really heavy. We're going to sprinkle this on top of the coffee cake, and this gets really heavy, so it sinks down in the dough, and it would not look very attractive, and the flavor wouldn't be as many places throughout the recipe. So if you go too far, you end up with this clumpy stuff. This one it's close to salvageable, but it still packs together way too easily. This is nice and light and airy, and this is what we want to put on the top of our coffee cake. So again, we're going to mise en place our ingredients for our batter before I start mixing anything together. And we're going to start by measuring our flour. And the flour for the cake part, or the batter part of the recipe, is 1.5 cups. So I'm going to stir that flour. It's been sitting when I aerated a little, so it's not packed down. Spoon it into the measuring cup. And then with our straight edge spatula or straight edge knife, level it off. And I'm going to get everything measured before I put anything together. That way, make sure I have everything in the right amounts. There's my flour. Now, you may have noticed that flour was in 2 different spots in the recipe, and that's because one amount goes into the cake and one amount goes into the topping. And it uses 2 different sugars. It's important that you do not get them mixed up. So I need 3/4 cup of granulated sugar. And so I'm going to do a 1/2 cup plus a 1/4 cup. Granulated sugar, remember, is the easiest ingredient to measure. Scoop it up, level it off, set that aside. Make sure your cup's all the way full front to back. So there's my granulated sugar. And then I need a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. So I like to keep my salt in a small container like this. It makes it easier to measure. And I'm going to have a custard cup to hold on to that salt. Just a 1/4 teaspoon. Scoop it up, level it off, set it aside. So that was pretty simple. Now I do need 1 egg, and so I'm going to crack the egg into a custard cup so that if I get any shell, it's easy to get out of the custard cup. I don't have to fish around the recipe. But more importantly, if there's any problem with the egg, it's easy to replace just the egg instead of all of the ingredients in the rest of the recipe or the rest of the bowl. So then lastly, last 2 ingredients I need are milk and cooking oil. So I need a 1/2 cup of milk and a 1/4 cup of cooking oil. And I'm going to measure the milk in the 2 cup liquid measuring cup. And remember, to measure liquid, I put the measuring cup on a level surface, pour the ingredient in until I believe I have the right amount. And then I check it at eye level. If it's too much, as I did here, I pour the excess back into the container. And if it's not enough, then I will add a little bit more to the measuring cup. So there's my 1/2 cup of milk. And then separately, I'm going to measure that 1/4 cup of oil. It's 2 ounces, 1/4 cup line, because there's 8 fluid ounces in a cup. So a 1/4 cup is 2 fluid ounces. So now we have everything that's necessary. There is an option to add 3/4 cup of raisins or chocolate chips to the batter. We are not going to do that for this demonstration, but if you decided to make this at home and chose to add those, you might find them to be a nice addition. One more extremely important ingredient in our recipe is 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And I'm just going to use this edge on the can with my measuring spoons. Make sure that it's a full teaspoon of baking powder. I'm just going to put that in with the salt until I'm ready to add it to my mixing bowl because they go in at the same time. And if you forget your baking powder, your cake is really going to turn out lousy. So it's a leavening agent. That's really important. It's what makes it rise and gives it the texture that it should have. So to start our cake batter off, we're going to add 1.5 cups of flour to our mixing bowl. And remember, when you choose your size of mixing bowl, you have to remember to have room to stir. So we're going to add 3/4 cup of granulated sugar. And then we're also going to add our salt and baking powder. Make sure all that gets in there. And we're going to whisk those together so that, again, it's one homogeneous mixture. We don't see standout areas of flour or sugar. And the whisk is nice because it adds air, it mixes thoroughly, and it helps eliminate any lumps that may form in the ingredients. And so once that's all mixed together, we're going to set that aside and we're going to work with our liquid ingredients. So that would be our milk, our oil, and our egg. So I put the milk in the 2-cup liquid measuring cup for a specific reason. I'm going to add, instead of getting another mixing bowl, I'm going to save a dish. And I'm just going to add the oil to the measuring cup for the milk. Make sure I scrape that clean so all the oil gets into the recipe. And then I'm going to add that egg. Notice how the milk and oil don't come together. Put that egg in there. And then I'm just going to use a regular fork to mix these together. This is an emulsion. We use a binder like egg to bring together 2 ingredients that don't like to naturally stay mixed together. So there you go, there's our egg and our oil. So whenever we are mixing a quick bread, we want to follow the method where we mix our dry ingredients, we mix our liquid ingredients separately, and then we're going to switch to a wooden spoon and make a well. That's what I did there. And then I'm going to pour my liquid ingredients into that well. Make sure everything again gets out of the measuring cup and into the recipe. And then just with the wooden spoon, I'm going to stir a few times, just enough to bring the ingredients together. The general rule of thumb when mixing quick breads is that we want to still have lumps, unless the recipe says otherwise. We want to still have lumps at the end of our mixing. When you mix it smooth, you over mix it and it makes it more tough. So I'm going to mix this just until I don't see any more dry ingredients, but the batter should still be a little lumpy. So here we go, all mixed together, ready to go into our pan. So if you remember at the beginning of the recipe, I sprayed the pan with cooking spray and I preheated the oven to 375 degrees. Now I'm going to transfer the batter from the mixing bowl to the baking pan. Again, scraping the bowl to make sure that all of the ingredients get into the baking pan, into the recipe. If you chose to add raisins or chocolate chips, You could either stir those in. You'd stir those in right before moving it to the pan. If you forgot, you could add them to the top and kind of press them in with a rubber scraper. Clean off my rubber scraper. And then get that last little bit of batter in there. And then we're going to take our topping that we've prepared and cover the top of the batter. It is essential that this goes into the pan before the cake goes into the oven. I'm going to try to make sure that it's all over the top of the cake. It won't stay on the cake if you try to put it on afterwards, so it has to go in before it bakes. Okay, so it's all covered. Now we're ready to bake it in a 375-degree oven for about 25 minutes. Okay, so what if I wanted to make this recipe just a little more indulgent without having to spend any more money? I could do that by making an extra batch of the topping, and I'm going to have it separate here, as you can see. And instead of putting it just on top, I'm going to take that batter and divide it in half and put about half of it in first. So then make sure it coats the bottom of the pan. Get that batter all over. And then I'm going to put topping halfway up and then again on the top. So coat the bottom of my pan with the batter. Take one recipe of the topping that I prepared and sprinkle it so it covers the surface of what will become the middle of the coffee cake. So I didn't spend any extra money. I didn't add any chips. I didn't add any nuts. I just used the ingredients that I already had there. We're just going to make it a little more cinnamony. So then we're going to take the rest of this batter and add it to the top on top of that topping. And then the tricky part will be spreading this around without disturbing the topping that we put down. So I'm going to make sure I add the batter in lots of places. That'll make it easier. Make sure I get all of it out of the mixing bowl. And off of the scraper and off of the spoon. And then very gently, like icing a cake, I'm going to move that so it covers the topping completely. Get it all to the edges of the pan. If I get a little on top of the batter, that's not a big deal because we're going to put topping on top of the batter. I want to move it as little as possible. Again, going to those edges as best we can. There we go. And then just adding this topping so it covers the coffee cake. And again, we're going to bake this in a 375-degree oven for about 25 minutes. So here you can see how our streusel coffee cake turned out. It's important to note that at the end of baking, to make sure that it's done, you should use a toothpick, insert it in the center, and it should come out clean indicating that all of the batter has cooked thoroughly. The one on the right, you can see has the extra layer of cinnamon inside, cinnamon streusel inside for that slightly elevated cinnamon flavor in your coffee cake.